This week we're going to shift to insects and mites that feed in a different way. They're going to feed by taking fluids out of the plants. And the kinds of insects that do this are usually those found in the order Hemiptera, things like leafhoppers, things like aphids, scale insects, mealybugs, whiteflies, the true bugs. The other group of insects that feeds on fluids, but in a very different manner, would be the thrips. And then there are mites that feed in their own way, but also feed on fluids. So the learning objectives for this week are to become familiar with the feeding habits that are associated with insects and mites that feed with sucking mouthparts. To understand conditions that contribute to damaging infestations of these types of insects and mites and how to detect developing problems. And to understand the principles involved in their management if necessary. So let's start with aphids, and it's going to take a little bit of work. This is part one. Because aphids are a very important group of insects. They occur throughout North America, perhaps a little more important in the northern half of the US than in the south, where you might have more mealybug and whitefly issues, but a very important group of insects. And very diverse too. In Colorado, we have over 350 species, and several of those are non-native, but most of those are native. Elsewhere, I'm sure there's equal numbers. So the insects we call aphids are in the family Aphididae, and this is a big family of insects. There is another group of insects that are sometimes called aphids. They are better known as the adelgids. These would be woolly-looking aphids that we see on conifers, a slightly different family. So these might be sometimes called a woolly aphid, particularly when we see them on conifers. We'll get to that, the term woolly aphid. So there's lots of aphids. Where I live, in the genus Populus, cottonwoods, aspens, there's over a dozen different species, and some are fairly uniform in appearance, and some might have patterns. Prunus is a genus of plants that has many species associated with them. So, and some of them are fairly damaging on a couple of fruit crops. Rose aphid, on roses, it's usually just one species, but the rose aphid, it can be a common insect, and it can come in green and come in pink. Lindens would be a plant that pretty much only has one species of aphid, but in areas where the linden aphid is well established, it can sometimes be quite important on this very popular kind of shade tree. The maples, they've got their own aphids. Some are native, like on the right, that would be the native aphids that are found in box elder. And on the left would be the Norway maple aphid that came over with the Norway maples that are widely planted now. The genus that probably has the most species of aphids is willow. Willow and populus, but willow has quite a few, and they're quite small species on leaves, and there's quite large ones on the stems. The largest kind of aphid we have here would be the giant willow aphid, and these will build up on the stems, maybe the sprouts, sucker sprouts, but stems and sometimes branches. They are big for an aphid. People sometimes mistake them for ticks, but aphids, of course, aren't all that big to begin with. There are other big aphids. In terms of a class of them, probably the ones in conifers would be the most commonly seen. So there are several what we call giant conifer aphids. They occur on different kinds of conifers, some on junipers, some on spruce, some on pines. And these are associated also with the limbs. The larger aphids are ones that feed on twigs and branches. The smaller ones will always be on the leaves. Some aphids may obscure themselves a bit with waxy material. It may come out as just a fine powder. In the picture here, though, we're seeing one where the wax is coming out in the form of long, thin threads on the back end of these leaf curl ash aphid. In some cases, the production of these waxy threads is so extensive that they completely obscure the insect. So the term woolly aphid will we'll see in a couple contexts, but woolly aphids, when we're talking about ones that are found on deciduous plants, are a type of aphid. And we see the woolly apple aphid on the stem there, and woolly beech aphid on the leaf on the lower left. These are true aphids, and they're just entirely covered with this wax, so you can't see the actual insect itself except when they molt, and then they'll expose themselves until they cover themselves back up again. The wax is also associated with the aphids you find in the roots. There are root infesting aphids, and often it's difficult for me to ever see the aphids themselves, but I'm also targeted to the site by looking at the wax and then poke around on the wax is where I'd find the aphids that were there feeding on the roots. The adelgids, those are the group that are on conifers that we call the woolly aphids that are found on those kinds of plants. This is a different family, has slightly different habits, feeds in a little bit different way, but they're often kind of combined with aphids when we're discussing them. But it is a different family, strictly conifer feeders. So the adelgids, the pine and spruce aphids. And there is one that is extremely damaging right now on native hemlocks in the eastern U.S., on the eastern hemlock and Carolina hemlock. The hemlock woolly adelgid is one of the most damaging forest insects we have at present, a non-native species that's been terribly destructive in the southern Appalachian area in particular. Now, getting back to aphid life cycles, aphids are small, aphids are soft, but that does not allow you to get away without molting. Again, all arthropods have to molt in order to get bigger. So here's an aphid stepping out of her old skin, and these old skins are left behind in the case of these kinds of insects. Now, all insects, of course, shed their skin as they molt, but the insects that have chewing mouthparts, a caterpillar or a beetle or grasshopper, they would turn around and consume it in most all cases. So you almost never see their old skins. But these can't chew. They've only got piercing sucking mouthparts. They can only feed on fluids. So they're left behind. And these old skins, these old exuviae is another term for them. But the old cast skins can sometimes be very useful for diagnostics. So here's a picture of a group of aphids that are a fairly attractive species that are orange with black cornicles, and you can see a couple of the cast skins in here, indicated by the arrows. There's also some other action that we'll discuss a little later, I think. Anyway, moving back to how they develop, a couple of things are peculiar to aphids, and one is the way that they normally reproduce is with the absence of males and asexual reproduction. In some cases, we have never seen a male of an aphid, and when they do occur, it will occur during one generation of the year, just before they go into their winter form, the egg, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But the norm for an aphid is to give live birth. That egg is hatched internally, and she to a genetically identical clone of herself, a daughter aphid. And the daughter aphid will mature very quickly, and probably in a week or 10 days or so. It all depends on temperature. But she is already producing her own embryos so that she's ready to reproduce and produce 5-6 young per day when she becomes an adult in a week and 10 days. So an aphid mother at the point of giving birth is not only a new mother, but she's a new expectant grandmother. Her kid is born pregnant. So live birth and asexual reproduction are the norm with aphids, and we picture in the lower right, you can see a mother giving birth. The ones on the left look a little different because those are winged aphids, and I've indicated two that are giving birth in this picture. There's also an ant nearby, something that's very commonly seen. So one of the hallmarks of aphids is their ability to rapidly reproduce. They have short generation time. They produce a lot of young, but this is largely at the expense of defense. These are almost non-defended. They can't bite, they can't sting, they're not poisonous. Rare exceptions might be if the plant they fed on was toxic. But most aphids are their only defense is to try to run away, which if you ever watch an aphid run, it's pretty pathetic. So lots of things will feed on aphids, and populations of aphids typically will take off very quickly and make it reach high level pretty quickly, but are usually then brought around through natural controls. So they boom and they bust. Now, one other peculiarity about aphids is that the ultimate adult form, the form that's achieved after the last molt, can either be a winged morph or a wingless morph. And that is not determined by genetics. Any one of them could do either. Has to do with aspects of the environment, uh, conditions that would favor them to want to leave the plant, perhaps if they're getting overcrowded or host quality was going down, that would cause a cascade of hormonal effects that might induce them to become winged instead of wingless. Also, certain times of the year when day length triggers come into play, that will induce them to become a winged form. Uh, so they could be winged or wingless. The norm would be a wingless aphid staying in place and just giving birth. But wing forms are the way that they get to new plants. And you can get a heads up when you look at a colony of aphids that they are going to be winged or wingless in the molt, in the stage just before the final molt. So in the picture here, indicated by the arrows, that's an aphid one molt away that will be winged in her ultimate form. She's got wing pads. That's what you can see there on the side. The aphids around her could all be genetically identical sisters, but they will remain wingless in that ultimate adult form, one molt away. So they may be winged or wingless, and the winged form is the way that they get to new plants. Now, being a winged aphid is an animal that is pretty helpless. They're poor flyers. Usually, wind speeds more than about 3 miles an hour. They're pretty much going the way the wind went. They can't see much at all. They're very tiny eyes. They can vaguely see differences in some colors, but it's no detail. They can't smell. The only way an aphid knows that something is a host plant is to land on it and taste it. And the way that they do this is pretty much by random landing. So they'll take off and land on a plant, probe it. If it's the right kind of plant, they'll stay. But it's almost never is the first time or the second time or maybe even the 50th time. But they will take off, land, probe, taste, accept or not. Seems very inefficient, but aphids can get around these winged forms. The example that made it for me was an aphid with the injury illustrated here called the honeysuckle witch's broom aphid. It's an aphid I happened to see when I was in Minnesota before I moved to my present position. Uh, and when it first came into the country or first came into the state of Minnesota, it we got a state record one year that was a new species in the state. Next year we could find it in every county. And the third year after we detected it, we could find it in every single honeysuckle of the whole state. Moved to Colorado. A couple years later, it came there too. First state record one year. Second year, we could find it in every county east of the Rocky Mountains. It took an extra year to get over the mountains, but within 4 years, we could find it essentially on every single honeysuckle in the entire state. So aphids, even though it's not efficient, because they produce so many, can usually find the host plants, some of them, and all it takes is one. Now, another complication. This aphids are a little complicated here. That we have is to how do they resolve the problem of getting through winter outdoors uh, if you have a cold climate? Because aphids are a kind of insect that can only live on a plant that's actively growing. They pull the sap from the phloem, the fluids from the phloem, and in winter the plants are dead or dormant, or it's too flat out cold to support them. They die. So what happens is that in areas with cold winters, aphids will produce an external egg, an egg that will be laid usually on a perennial plant, but in a site where it's likely they'll be able to find a plant next spring, and it will remain dormant through the winter. This is just goes for the one aphids where they're up against a hard winter, a freeze. Indoors, some of these aphids may reproduce year round, but outdoors they have to produce an egg to get through. And this brings up a couple of terms and on the life history of aphids. And let's talk about this first point that's illustrated here. It's called the holocyclic life cycle. So one thing that happens with aphids that have to produce an overwintering egg is they will also, before that egg is produced, have one sexual generation. So I said the norm is for aphids to give live birth to genetically identical daughters. Well, just prior to the time the egg is produced, you will get a sexual generation. You'll get a sexual formed females and a male. And the mating of these two will ultimately result in an externally laid egg by the aphid. That is the stage that survives winter. Furthermore, many aphids, well, about half of them perhaps, will lay their egg on a kind of plant that will allow them to get through the winter, and they'll be feeding on in the spring, but then they will move to a second plant or second kind of plant or plants in the summer. So they'll have winter hosts and summer host alternation. Not all of them do this, but let's talk about the holocyclic life cycle. So in this case, we'll see what eggs might typically look like on some kind of woody plant. In this case, these little jelly bean-like objects laid near the bud, those would be aphid eggs. These would be aphid eggs laid on a stem of a plum tree, I think. And these would be aphid eggs on pine, which I find the easiest to see. Some of the aphid eggs on rose in my garden. So these are the overwintering stages. Now, to get to that egg, let's kind of go through this life cycle because it is fairly involved, and in some cases, like the one I'll show here, it is one of these species that has two hosts, a winter host and a different summer host. And the insect we'll talk about is the green peach aphid, Mysis persicae. Outdoors, in areas where it's cold, this undergoes the holocyclic life cycle. It also shows host alternation. So this would be a diagram of the holocyclic life cycle. On the left would be the summer generations, and everything to the right would be what's happening on the winter host, the one that's colonized in fall and develops on the plant in spring when the eggs hatch. So in this photo, the arrow sort of indicates the egg that is laid at the base of this peach bud. So the eggs of the green peach aphid in the wintertime would be laid near a bud of their winter host. For this species, those winter hosts would be things like apricots, peaches, nectarines, and some plums, some cherries they've been occasionally found on too. Not very many. Anyway, the egg will hatch in spring shortly after bud break. So the buds of the plant break, there's leaves, then the aphid egg hatches. So the stage that hatches from that egg we call a stem mother, and she feeds on the newly expanding leaves. When she's full grown, she starts to produce young in the normal fashion. And then when they get full grown, they will produce young in the normal fashion. A female, without mating, giving live birth to a genetically identical daughter. They may have several generations on the plant, and in the case of the green peach aphid, they may also curl the new leaves. Not all aphids do this, but this one does. And then, sometime in the middle of June, day length is the trigger, all of them will switch to become a wing form, and all of them will then take off from that plant, and you will no longer find it on that prunus, that peach, that apricot for the rest of the summer. To find this aphid, it's on various kinds of herbaceous plants, pigweed or spinach or potatoes or lettuce, or lots of different plants will be summer hosts, and they'll have multiple generations on these summer hosts during the warm season. continual summer generations, maybe 5, 6, maybe 10 generations in the summer. And then, once again, a strange thing happens. In late summer, day length triggers a change in the population so that they then produce forms that disperse. These are not only uh, females, a special female form that leaves, but also males show up. And these wing forms seek out the prunus that will allow them to get through winter. And if they find it, they will stay, and the male will mate with a sexual form, egg producing form of the insect, and that will result in the eggs that will get through winter. So, again, fairly involved life cycle involving both summer and winter hosts. So, this is an aphid that I have had in the past, quite important in my own garden on parsley and dill for several years, but I no longer have a problem with it. And the reason is because I did something accidentally to resolve the problem. And why do I no longer have this issue on aphids on dill or parsley in the garden in the summer? Well, that insect is known as the willow carrot aphid. And that is an aphid that develops on parsley, dill, carrots, and related species in the summer, but has as its winter host certain willows. And in the course of doing a house remodel, I got rid of my willow. Prior to that, they were going from the willow to my garden, back to the willow. The willow's gone. There's no other willows in my neighborhood. This insect no longer shows up in my garden. This is an example of what I call a double or nothing pest. One of these aphids that have host alternation, requiring 2 host species to complete their development. And if both are there, then the insect might be quite abundant. But if one of the hosts is missing, they're much less common. So, again, a local example, but this is a woolly elm aphid showing injury that it does on its winter host. It survives as eggs on elms, certain elms, and when they develop, they will curl the leaves of those elms. In early summer, they produce wing forms that then move to the roots of a different plant, in this case, amelanchier, and they can be quite damaging. And in this image here, showing up a nursery where they were trying to grow serviceberry amelanchier seedlings for production for shelter belts, and they were being extremely heavily damaged. We could treat for them. We can control it with insecticides, but this nursery had elms as the shelter belts, and they're trying to grow serviceberry 100 feet away. So it made it very difficult. Not the situation you'd want. Another insect that you might see sometimes digging up a beet or lamb's quarters or quinoa, if you're growing that, would be the sugar beet root aphid. It survives the winter on certain kinds of poplars and cottonwoods, and it makes galls on those poplars and cottonwoods in the spring, and then leaves those galls, those little growths on the leaves, to move in the summer to the roots of these beet hosts or lamb's quarters and related quinopods. And as a final example, this is an aphid that I started noticing next door when my father-in-law started growing moneywort. And it was not an aphid I'd ever seen before. And it turns out it was a species that hadn't been known to be present in North America. It was an insect called the Cabius lysimachii. And the reason we had it so bad at my father-in-law's place next door was that the alternate host of this was black poplar. It makes galls or twists the leaves in spring on that host, the one it survived winter on, and then moves to the moneywort. And there was a moneywort in my father-in-law's house yard, and 2 doors away there was a black poplar, only one in the neighborhood. They were going back and forth. Black poplar died. We've never seen the aphid again since that tree got taken out, its alternate host. So some aphids will host alternate around here. Most aphids associated with rosaceous plants, particularly Prunus and Crataegus. Many of them associated with populus. The aphids on elms, Russian olive, viburnum. These are all ones that host alternate in our area. But then there's many that don't. Rose aphid is a kind of aphid that doesn't undergo host alternation. Just rose. It just develops on rose. Um, so single host aphids, and these again more Rocky Mountain State examples. Essentially, all the aphids associated with conifers are single host aphids, although the adelgids host alternate. A couple that are associated with populus, the ones in oak, maple, honeysuckle, spirea. Um, uh, these are some aphids that do not alternate between hosts that are local examples. And in areas where crepe myrtle is a popular plant, crepe myrtle aphid would be a single host aphid. Very high numbers building up in the leaves on the right, and I think you might be able to see a little bit of gray on the leaves on the plant on the left, and that's the sooty mold we'll talk about in the next bit.